for joining me for another book review. I'm going to do something today that I'm not overly keen on the idea of doing, and reviewing a book that I really did not enjoy. This is The Brothers York, an English tragedy by Thomas Penn. So if we start with the cover, it looks fairly attractive. I guess there's the Murray of the House of York used in the cover. Not quite sure what the three sons with the three crowns is supposed to depict. The three sons in Yorkist mythology comes from the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, at which Edward said they represented the Father, the Son and the Holy Ghost. It seems to be a much later fictional invention that it was meant to represent the three sons of the House of York in Edward, George and Richard, two of whom would go on to become kings. So I don't know why we have three crowns at the bottom. So it's not a great start for the book. Not overly fond of the cover and not quite sure what it's supposed to mean. So what this book is about really is the Yorkist dynasty, their rise to power when Edward IV became king in 1461, the period of his two reigns between 1461 and 1470, and then 1471 to 1483, in the middle of which he was booted off the throne for a while for the re-adeption of King Henry VI. And the book goes into a lot of details about Edward's reign. It's a fairly hefty book, but the vast majority of this deals with Edward's reign, and an awful lot of it is to do with Edward's financial preoccupations and his business dealings. George appears as a little bit of a nuisance, and then Richard makes an appearance at the end, which is really less than satisfactory in the way that it's presented. What I would say is good about this book is the fact that the prose is incredibly well written. It flows very well. It's a strong narrative history. It moves at a good pace. It keeps you interested. Although to some extent, I would probably say that that makes its shortfalls even worse. So I guess the bad about this book is pretty much everything else, unfortunately. I really didn't enjoy it. I'm going to read the review that I wrote for another publication of this book, because I think I've avoided trying to criticise too much the differences that I would have in interpretation with a lot of what the book says, and stick to some of the kind of factual errors and glaring mistakes that are made in the text. I'm just going to read this review to you anyway. Many Ricardians have enjoyed Penn's The Winter King, his telling of the later years of Henry VII. That's mainly because Penn is highly critical of Henry, his policies and his personality. You may have been looking forward then to The Brothers York as a sympathetic re-evaluation of Edward IV, George Duke of Clarence and Richard III. If so, you'll be disappointed. This book is something of a triumph, sadly, of style over substance, traditional views over fresh thinking, of the conviction of an historian beyond reproach over an inquiring mind. That sounds harsh, but I stand by it, and here's why. The narrative is undeniably well crafted and engaging. It has the pacey flow of a novel, and Penn's gift for storytelling is abundantly apparent. Sadly, that was the extent of my enjoyment. Much of the book is concerned with Edward IV's reign, with George and Richard playing bit parts, so the whole book feels much more like a biography or a life of Edward IV, rather than the three brothers equally. The Winter King made regular diversions into examining the alum trade, in itself fascinating, but often too far disconnected from the real topic of the book. The alum trade makes the briefest appearance in The Brothers York as a gateway to discuss what feels like the real interest of the writer, Italian banking. Jaunts to Italy and France, as well as the appearance of Italian bankers who loaned Edward money, take on a lively spirit and a life of their own, as Penn uses state papers to imagine the inner thoughts and rivalries of Medici Bank representatives across Europe. None of which, of course, are presented as possibilities, but, like everything else, as solid, immutable fact. Edward IV's appetites feature heavily in the book, with unsourced, unflinching assertions that Edward's medical advisers had long made concerned noises about his prodigious feats of consumption and sexual activity. Although Edward dominates the book, it's Penn's handling of Richard that I suspect will most interest readers. Me too. Prepare for epic levels of not only disappointment, but irritation. There are parts of the interpretation of events and sources that I disagree with. For me, that's fine. It's so wide open to interpretation that I'm happy to consider a different viewpoint. Let's take, for example, Penn's handling of Anne Beauchamp, Countess of Warwick, mother-in-law to Richard and George. Let's be in no doubt, she was treated abysmally, declared legally dead by Parliament in 1474, so that her lands and dower interest could be passed to her daughters, meaning her sons-in-law. John Rouse claims that Richard imprisoned Anne for the rest of her life, ignoring the fact that she outlived him. However, Rouse also wrote that Anne had viewed Richard as her chief refuge. She would live with her son-in-law for 10 years. Penn describes Edward and Richard having cooked up a plan, showing that Richard was proving remorseless in pursuit of his rights. George is entirely absent as culpable in the legal contortions from which he gained more than Richard, Anne's dispenser lands in particular. Richard had abducted her, keeping her securely at Middleham with the aim of forcing her to hand over her estates to him. Except having been declared, by Edward IV, legally dead, Anne had nothing to sign over to Richard and no legal substance with which to achieve it. It feels Shakespearean in the careful laying of the groundwork for what one ominously senses is coming. There are other anomalies that don't really tie into the source material. Based on Crowland, Penn has George keeping Anne Neville as a kitchen maid in the precincts of St Martin's le Grand. What Crowland actually says is that Richard rescued her from a house of one of George's men and delivered her into sanctuary at St Martin's. Penn simply explains that both George and Richard saw Anne as a possession, and that Richard snatched her. His conceit of having her already at St Martin's suggests both that Richard abducted her from sanctuary and took her into his own custody, not extracted her from the custody of his brother and delivered her into sanctuary. Crowland, it seems, is just inconveniently nice to Richard, and so is distorted. Richard's dealings with France are particularly interesting, not least for the glaring factual errors embedded in the account to once more take any glint from his reputation. At Picquigny, Richard wasn't really opposed to the peace. He just wanted to look like he was. Missing the meeting was a neat way of distancing himself from the treaty in the eyes of his troops and those back home, while at the same time accepting it. To compound this, Penn later claims that Richard was fine with Edward's refusal to help their sister Margaret in the wake of Charles the Bold's death. He accepted it blandly enough. After all, he was on good terms with the king's close advisers, and in any case, he had his own French pension to think of. No evidence of Richard's receipt of a pension is provided, and no discussion given to the fact that no one else has ever said that he accepted one. By this point, it's clear where Penn is taking his story of Richard. George Neville, erstwhile Duke of Bedford, seems to have had a lucky escape from Richard's ruthless marauding. His disinheriting was all Richard's doing. He made Edward remove the dukedom to lessen the threat to Richard's position, and because, it would appear, Richard was frustrated that Neville was alive. Unable to do away with George Neville physically, Richard could at least make him disappear politically. The implication is clear. Richard would have delighted in killing George Neville to tighten his grip on the northern lands if he could have. This is the kind of claim I find most frustrating, because even the most hostile writer can offer no example of Richard killing someone for personal gain during his tenure in the north. Here, we're assured, he wanted to commit such a vicious crime, but found himself prevented. There's so much more to say. The Scottish campaign was a disaster, mostly Richard's fault, of course. Penn has Richard and Lord Stanley falling out on the way home and ending up in a pitched battle. At Salford Bridge, there was a standoff between armed retainers of the two lords. In the fight that followed, Stanley's men made off with one of Richard's banners. This seems to be a reworking of a Stanley family legend that supposedly took place in the northwest more than a decade earlier. There's no evidence it happened then, unless after the Scottish campaign. The County Palatine Edward created for Richard was simply a licence to conquer parts of Scotland to assuage Richard's unquenchable lust for power, without mention of the authority that it gave him in England. But to 1483 to 1485. Edward's deathbed scene is emotionally presented as fact rather than later Tudor imagining, and Penn appears to have knowledge of the contents of Edward's lost will, much as he earlier knew what had been discussed in the lost records of the re-adeption Parliament. Elizabeth Woodville was quick to conciliate, having written to Richard to tell him, though he already knew about his brother's death somehow. Richard is contacted in York by Buckingham, when who contacted whom and where isn't known. Penn has Richard and Buckingham as close childhood friends in a manner unsupported by evidence, but laying down more foundation stones. At Northampton, Richard is already plotting to usurp the kingdom, even if he hadn't consciously admitted it to himself, playing on the traditionalist scheming view of events. At the same time, William Catesby is already secretly, hence no evidence of it of course, mobilising the Midlands for Richard. Penn then claims to offer an eyewitness account of Edward V and Richard's meeting at Stony Stratford from possibly the royal physician John Argentine. Rivers, Grey and Vaughan are packed off to Pontefract, ignoring their separation to 3 different castles because that might require a later admission of a trial for them. In London, Richard is confirmed as protector, but no mention is offered of Crowland's explanation that he was given powers to act as another king, so that any form of regency that would explain Richard's actions is glossed over in silence. The claim that Richard demanded the executions of Rivers and his cellmates is accepted without question, even though it only appears in the ill-informed Mancini's account. Penn explains that the council clearly diverted the request by pointing out that Richard hadn't been protector at the time. In fact, Mancini says it was because Richard held no national office, which is demonstrably incorrect. At one point, Penn even misquotes Crowland to place a darker spin on the events of 1483. Crowland wrote that Richard was given power to order and forbid in every matter, just like another king. Penn contorts this quote so that now he was commanding and forbidding in everything like another king. The change of emphasis to an active voice makes it not only more forbidding, but plain wrong, the misuse of source material. Penn's Richard from 1483 onwards is based almost entirely on Moore and Virgil, with a smattering of Mancini and Crowland, where they support the Tudor writers' versions of events. In another shocking, I jaw hit the floor at this one, claim, Penn has Moore's episode at the Tower on the 13th of June proven as fact. The worst bit of it, too, the Withered Arms story. This, he explains, was Richard holding out his arms in front of him to show that one was shorter than the other, a result of the scoliosis that had passed off as Woodville witchcraft. I know, that's what I thought. Stanley's presence is taken as proven, even though this writer believes that he wasn't there. The arrest and blow to the head are smoothly glossed over by the time of the coronation, when they were all smiles again. On the execution of Rivers, Grey and Vaughan, Penn cites Moore's claim that there was no due process to present it as worse than anything the Earl of Warwick had ever done in vicious retribution, ignoring the gathering of prisoners at Pontefract and John Rouse's assertion that Northumberland acted as their judge. Loyalty Melee is adopted by Richard as a new royal motto after his coronation, ignoring its use before he arrived in London. Moore's error in claiming the pre-contract named Dame Elizabeth Lucy is passed off as a mistaken first name only. He meant Margaret Lucy, the name Penn asserts was given in June 1483, supplied by her son John Wake. The excuse-making and contortion is frankly laughable by this point, particularly when Virgil's account seemed to be passed off as that of a bystander. The sermon claimed that both Edward IV was a bastard and that his marriage was bigamous, when no source combines those claims, and only Mancini, misunderstanding in my opinion what was said, mentions Edward IV's legitimacy. Eleanor Butler's name only appears in 1484 when she's been pinpointed as focus for the stories in Titulus Regius, the insinuation being that the story had continually changed to try and cover the lies. After the coronation and what's described as a wedding feast, the rumours came in a torrent that Richard has killed his nephews, and this simply isn't true, and no consideration is given to any other reason for disaffection with Richard's rule. Edward IV's men were unswervingly and unfalteringly loyal to his memory and to his son Edward V. Those around Richard were only interested in self-preservation and personal gain. Penn has Richard inventing the Council of the North in 1484, ignoring a dozen years of its existence. In discussing Henry VI's reburial, Henry Tudor is unnervingly described as Henry VI's rather more troublesome living descendant. The story that Richard planned to marry Elizabeth of York is entirely bought into. At Christmas 1484, Richard had ordered Anne and Elizabeth to swap clothes, and with them, identities. For Richard, marrying his niece made political sense. And there's absolutely no mention of the inconvenient Portuguese marriage negotiations that would distract from the distaste of this story. I could go on, but you might need a cup of tea by now, or something stronger. Solving another centuries-long mystery, we're assured that Francis Lovell saw out his days after Stokefield in Scottish exile, and reminded that Clarence's son was a harmless backward child, ignoring his high position in the Council of the North and the care that Richard took of him. With an astonishing lack of self-awareness, Penn concludes that, in decades to come, accounts of Edward's self-indulgence and Richard's tyranny were offered to monarchs as examples of how not to do it, their authors often more concerned with flattering or pointing out the foibles of their dedicatees than with the accuracy of their history. Edward, here, is a lazy glutton who knew how to get money quickly but spent it even faster, and caused all his own problems. Richard is still a murdering tyrant, Moore and Shakespeare's monster, buttressed against the swelling tide of revisionist history. George is an afterthought, not even appearing in the summing up. For all its hailing by some reviewers as the greatest work on the period, this book is, frankly, factually wrong in too many places to be any use to a reader genuinely interested in understanding it. Beneath the flowery words is a rehash of discredited secondary sources presented as eyewitness accounts. I can't, in all honesty, recommend this book to anyone considering reading it. That probably sounds really, really harsh, but I stick by everything that I've said in there. I tried to pick out the factual errors and the misuse of source material because it avoids questions of interpretation that are wide open. So for my review, I don't know, I struggle to even give this book 1 star out of 5, to be perfectly honest, and I would strongly suggest that no one reads it or accepts it as a history of the period of Yorkist rule.